Mini episode 1131 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge, mini episode number 1131. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris coming your way today, and we have another great conversation coming up with an author that we've had on the show a bunch of times previously. It is always a pleasure to delve into the various works that he has, and it's always a matter of when we have him on here for the show that professes to be the show where nothing is off topic, really sort of proving that and sort of stretching the bounds here, because he's always writing about new and interesting different topics. This one is a little far afield from what some of his past books have been. It is called Four Friends, Promising Lives Cut Short, and I can probably do no better as far as summing up what this is about than giving you a little blurb from the book jacket. So here goes. Jack Berman, the child of impoverished Holocaust survivors, uses his unlikely Andover pedigree to achieve the American dream, only to be cut down in an unimaginable act of violence. Will Daniel, Harry Truman's grandson and the son of the managing editor of the New York Times, does everything possible to escape the burdens of a family legacy he's ultimately trapped by. Harry Bull builds the life of a careful, successful Chicago lawyer and heir to his family's fortune before taking an inexplicable and devastating risk on a beautiful summer day. And the life and death of John F. Kennedy, Jr., a story we think we know, is told here with surprising new details that cast it in an entirely different light. Now, these four gentlemen came to mind for this author because he happened to know all of them, was friends to varying degrees with all of them at Andover back in the day, the legendary East Coast prep school. And again, they all ran in the same circles at the time, and subsequently there is a burden that connects them of tragedy and of different types of tragedies. And so this is sort of an interesting walkthrough of their stories. You'll find some commonalities, you'll find a lot of differences. It is a fascinating read, and that is the one thing we can always say by any book that is written by William Cohan, and it is a pleasure to have him back on the show. William, thank you so much for making time for us today. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Rick, and thank you for that kind introduction.
Well, I really mean it, because it's a great book, and it's always great to talk to you, because you're always taking an interesting look at things, whether when we've had you on before, whether it be looking at things with Lehman Brothers, whether it be the Duke lacrosse scandal. Ultimately, your writing and your investigations, and sometimes in a non-author capacity, just in terms of as a columnist or other work that you do, but you're always taking an angle on this that I find intriguing. And I know I talked a little bit about the thought process that you had here, but I think the listeners would probably like to hear it from your lips as far as how this project sort of came together in your head with all these people you knew back in the day at Andover.
Well, I think the first thing I wanted to do was to try to do something different than I had done before. You know, I'd written 4 books about Wall Street, 3 about powerful firms and, what happened to them during sort of their histories, and 1 book about the Duke lacrosse scandal that you mentioned. And so those were all books about, powerful institutions. And so I actually wanted to write about Andover, an institution that is sort of also powerful in its way, and that I had, the privilege to attend. But I didn't want to write about Andover as an institution per se. I wanted to write about what happened to 4 of my friends who happened to be there at the same time that I was there, and how they lived their lives after we went our separate ways. Nowadays we sort of take keeping in touch with everybody for granted. I mean, it's so easy between a cell phone or some sort of social media account or connection. But back in the early to late 70s, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, there was no social media. there was very few ways to keep in touch with people. I mean, I suppose if you knew somebody's payphone number in their dorm room at college, you could keep up with them, but let's face it, that's not going to happen very often. And most guys don't write guys letters, so, excuse me. And so this became a way for me to both remember and reflect upon what happened to my friends, and also have a serious investigative reporting challenge like I'd had in my other books. So in many ways, it gave me, this opportunity to do something different, to look at an institution from a different perspective, sort of turning the lens around a little bit by writing about these friends of mine and their experiences at Andover, and then what happened to them after they left Andover, and how they made their way in the world before they met their untimely deaths. And it gave me, of course, a chance to, only John Kennedy, of course, was well known, and there was, of course, a lot of, there have been books written about him and plenty of articles. The other three, presented me with quite a reporting challenge, because I had to go around and talk to their friends and their family members and their widows and their girlfriends, and really figure out how they had lived their lives after they left Andover, and after I really didn't know them that well anymore. So for me, it was kind of the ultimate way to have a great intellectual challenge, and also to remember my friends in a special way.
Well, you really, really told their stories in a very, very compelling manner. There's no question about that. And as far as your point about the instant communications of today versus the way it was when you guys left school subsequently, because one of the things that, one of the predominant themes, obviously, of this book is the fragility of life, even for, scions of the rich and powerful, as pretty much all of these guys were to one degree or another, or at least successful individuals, let's just say that. And again, there had to be a grapevine of some kind of sort. When Jack was killed in the shooting in '93, it wasn't necessarily anything where he himself was big in the news, but that was, as you point out in the book, a notable shooting, probably the most shocking act of violence in San Francisco since the fall of '78 with Moscone and Milk and the Jim Jones hangover at the time. So that was something that really shocked the conscience of the Bay Area and of California. And then these other things here, you look at the JFK Jr. thing, I believe chronologically that was the third of the four tragedies, and subsequently the boating accident afterwards with Harry. You get the sense, though, that even if there had been instant communications, it might not have necessarily changed the trajectory of anything. These individuals, particularly the three deaths subsequently, because there's really nothing that Jack probably could have done to avoid his. That seems like wrong place, wrong time. The other three, to one degree or another, they seem to have put themselves in that spot. And you get the sense that whether it be the hubris of thinking that you have life by the short hairs, or whatever the case may be, it just seems to me that even in an age of instant communications, like, oh, look at what happened to this guy, oh, I don't want to have happen to me what happened to this guy, it seems like that might not have changed the trajectory, even if they were fully aware of these other stories at the time. Do you have the same sense of that?
Excuse me again. In many ways, I sort of came to the conclusion as I was writing this that they died very much like how they had lived, as a almost a consequence of how they had lived. I mean, obviously, Jack Berman was definitely at the wrong place at the wrong time, and there's nothing he could have done differently. But he was such a good Samaritan. He was such a good egg. He was working at a law firm and convinced them in San Francisco, and convinced them to essentially have a pro bono practice presenting people who felt they had been wrongfully dismissed from their place of employment. And he was representing a client who had gotten wrongfully dismissed, she thought, from EDS, which was Ross Perot's firm. And he was at the EDS's law firm at 101 California, administering the deposition for his client, and then this disgruntled former client of the law firm came in with a bag full of automatic weapons and began to wreak mass destruction. But I mean, if it's almost like Jack was such a good person, and he was in this place and doing this wonderful thing for this client of his, and unfortunately, this was the end that he met.
Right.
Will Daniel always sort of lived a bit of a reckless life, an itinerant life, trying to run away from his grandfather, from his family, from his Park Avenue existence, and yet, he probably drank too much, was a little too itinerant, and how many 40-year-olds are like going to parties at 2 a.m. in Brooklyn with a bunch of work people? I mean, maybe that happens, but instead of going back to his apartment where he lived in Englewood, New Jersey, which made things difficult because he liked to, stay in New York, in Manhattan, he ended up having to go back to his family apartment on Park Avenue, and that's when he met his end. Harry Bull, of course, liked to go sailing in Lake Michigan and to take chances there that he probably shouldn't have taken. And of course, with John Kennedy, I mean, I think this is a guy who grew up thinking that the normal rules of the road and of life and of the and of human existence didn't apply to him. Frankly, I think that's probably, he wasn't wrong about that. I don't think any of the normal rules of human behavior applied to him. I mean, he's the only child born to a president-elect in this country's history. He literally grew up in the White House until his father was assassinated. The way he saluted at his father's funeral, worked its way into our collective consciousness. And, I literally watched people get into his presence and change their behavior to try to appeal to him and to try to make sure that they stayed in his circle. And so he probably thought the regular rules of the road did not apply to him. So in answer to your question, I just sort of came to the conclusion that obviously social media wouldn't have changed any of this. It would have made it easier for us all to keep in touch. But, I felt like in many ways these 4 guys died a little bit as an outgrowth of how they had lived their lives.
I think that's a very compelling common thread there. I would kind of agree with you after having read this book. I think that's a very good insight. A lot to unpack there with what you said about these guys. There's a few things that jump out at me, and the thing with Will, with being the grandson of Harry Truman, there's a number of things in there where, as I'm reading it, I mean, from my perspective, don't necessarily come off as being as sympathetic, but when I get to the part, I sort of sympathize with him at a part that I really didn't think that I would. The part about the rededication of the USS Missouri and going there, and where his mother was going to be front and center, and it was going to be in honor of his grandfather, and they were just sort of asking him to put aside his politics and everything like that. I think it's fair from reading this to say that his politics probably don't match up very well with mine, nor my thoughts on family loyalty versus what he ended up doing. But this is one of those weird things, though. I almost weirdly do have sympathy for him because particularly if he had the thoughts that he did about nuclear weapons, and he seemed to have some issues with that ship having nuclear capabilities. His grandfather is literally the only man in the history of the planet that ever dropped the bomb, and did it twice. So you wonder what kind of a thought that could leave in your psyche, particularly if you come to question the morality of it, as so many have subsequently. So that's a unique and sort of interesting burden to carry around. If you're completely convinced of the righteousness of it, then it's not a burden. If you're not as convinced about it, then that might account maybe for some of why he was as ambivalent, or perhaps worse than ambivalent, about his family heritage.
I think that's very perceptive on your part, and absolutely right. I mean, you contrast Will's experience with his grandfather and the dropping of the atomic bombs with Will's older brother, Cliff. The last time I talked to Cliff, Cliff, first of all, he embraced his family. He is on the board of the Truman Foundation or the Truman College or Foundation or whatever. And at one point, I don't know that he actually succeeded in doing this, but he was going to write a book about his grandfather dropping the nuclear bombs. So he would freely talk about who his grandfather was, and Will never would talk about it. He would get mad at his older brother, angry at his older brother for mentioning to anybody that they were related to Harry Truman, because obviously their last name was Daniel and not Truman, so it wasn't a given like with John F. Kennedy Jr., who his family was in his lineage. So Will felt very ambivalent about all of this, and obviously it all came out at that rededication of the SS Truman with nuclear weapons, and he just freaked out and basically abandoned the family and the ceremony, even after they had sort of spent weeks encouraging him to stay calm. The woman who went with him, who was his good friend, tried to encourage him to keep it together, but he just couldn't do it. And I think that he was a very complex guy, and I think a lot of that comes through in that section of the book. And one of the favorite lines that he wrote, which I think shows just how complex he was, and my youngest son pointed this out as well as one of his favorite lines. He wrote a letter to one of his Yale roommates who was living in St. Louis as a lawyer, and he wrote a letter about how he just started dating a new woman, and Will never got married. He was dating a new woman, but he now sort of made it a practice to break up with her before they really got dating to get that out of the way, because he knew that at some point he wasn't going to be able to commit to a long-term relationship, and he was going to have to break up and get on with his life and go in a different direction. And so to sort of shortcut that process, it was part funny, right, but part very revealing about his own character and his character flaws and his inability to commit to anybody or kind of anything. I thought that was quite revelatory.
Yes, I think so as well. And again, in terms of the common thread that was shared, at the very least, in terms of Will and Harry and John Kennedy Jr., in terms of how their deaths were all in to whatever degree or another certainly preventable, this is one of these things where my sense is that this book is very relatable. Because even if, again, when you're going to Andover, you are surrounded by people who many would say are the winners of life's lottery, or however you would classify it, but people who have the world right there at their fingertips. And I will tell you, I don't identify with that personally, because I come from a working class suburb in Parma, Ohio, and everyone's parents were either blue collar or, in the case of mine, teachers, so white collar but not wealthy. And then you add on to that a lot of our parents at the time being World War II babies. So a real sense of sort of practicality of being sort of rooted to the earth in a way where nobody really sort of had the kind of flights of fancy. But then every once in a while there'd be somebody who was capable of breaking beyond that. I think back to our class valedictorian who went to MIT, and again, they're just reputed to be one of the most brilliant people on God's green earth, but then goes to MIT, and some of that recklessness kind of kicks in. It passes away in a DUI accident. Everyone was really kind of shocked, but it was a thing where, he was flying on those gossamer wings, it seemed like, So I think a lot of us probably at least know one story like this of somebody who had sort of graduated to the elite in society and then just couldn't handle it. Much like alcohol and other things like that, gambling, there might just be people, William, that are just incapable of handling this kind of privilege and incapable of feeling anything other than invulnerable.
Well, let me say about Andover at that time, in the mid-'70s. I mean, obviously, it was an elite institution. I felt privileged to be there.
Sure.
It's the oldest secondary school in the country. It had graduated two presidents of the United States, the only high school in the country to do that, the Bush father and son. But I will say this, in the mid-'70s, unlike in later decades, the discrepancy between rich and poor was not nearly what it is today. The wealth inequality is not nearly what it is today. I mean, there were, yes, children of privilege, people like Will Daniel, John F. Kennedy Jr., Harry Bull, but there were also people like Jack Berman and me. We came from much more ordinary homes, not impoverished by any means, but there were people. I mean, one of the important credos of Andover was that youth from every quarter was welcome there. And so I felt in Andover an extreme amount of ecumenical fervor. I didn't feel people were judging one another for any reason at all, basically, but if they were judging, it was because of, how they ranked sort of academically and intellectually and creatively. It wasn't about who had more money or who had more privilege or who had more opportunity. I felt that was not nearly as prevalent in the mid-1970s as it obviously is today. There were not people whose parents had private jets and homes in the Hamptons and there weren't billionaires walking around every time you turned to your left or your right, and there weren't these people of children of extreme wealth. The most kind of the wealthiest person we could kind of think of at that time was probably John F. Kennedy Jr., and that's because his mother was married to Aristotle Onassis for a period of time. I mean, so I guess I would say that I definitely feel privileged to have gone there and to shared experiences with these people, and obviously I wanted to write about that, but it wasn't nearly what I think people probably think of it as when they think about Andover. Oh, those privileged, white kids, who cares about them? I mean, I think that these were real people. They had real issues that we all confront, hopes and dreams, and they confronted the real world just like everybody has to confront the real world. And the myths that were created at Andover about, what you could do to succeed and your path to glory, I think each and every one of them confronted that in their lives after they left Andover, and I think I have too. And I think it's just a very sort of interesting dynamic that takes place and seeps into your DNA. And when you go to a place like this, it makes you seem like you're, as I say in the book, part of some sort of Delta Force, some seemingly invincible, but in fact, in the real world, we're all too invincible. We're all too human. One day you can think you're going for a sail on the Lake Michigan with your two of your three children, and the next thing you know, that's it. You think you will be coming home from a party in Brooklyn, crossing Park Avenue, and that's it. You think you're going for the weekend to, your family compound, to a wedding in the southern coast of Massachusetts, and that's it. Or you're going up to work representing your client at a deposition, and that's it. And that's the way life can be. You think you're going to the Walmart one morning in El Paso, and that's it. Or in Dayton. I mean, and you realize that life is very fragile, as you said. I tried to capture the fragility of life, regardless of your where you were born and how you were raised. Life is fragile, and I think you have to remember that as you go through it and try. And it's not easy, but try to live your best life that you can, every day.
Absolutely, and I think that's the predominant theme of the book, in my estimation anyways, is the fragility of life. And I'm glad you fleshed out the differences between Andover then and now, because I think that's very illuminating. To bring this thing all the way around, I have to ask you, about some of the JFK Jr. stuff in here, because I think I might be able to. I'm going to frame a question in a way that probably nobody's ever done before when it relates to JFK Jr., because we're not used to thinking of him this way. We think of him frozen in time, that tabloid figure. I mean, I've seen him in the tabloids again just recently with the new, they're dredging up stuff about the 90s and his life with his wife prior to then. But it's interesting because you take a look ahead, potentially ahead anyways, at what might have awaited had things gone differently for him, potentially a run against George Pataki in '02. And we're used to thinking about society, how would things have been different if John F. Kennedy had lived, had not been assassinated in 1963. I actually watched that great show on Hulu, 11/22/63, where they sort of paint a picture of what might have happened if he lived. We're used to thinking of that, how things would have been different, or if Bobby hadn't been assassinated in '68. Nobody ever thinks about how society would be different if JFK Jr. lived, because at the time that he perished, he wasn't on that level. But you look ahead, and again, he's frozen in time, so we don't know what a post 9/11 John F. Kennedy looks like in the arena, JFK Jr. We don't know. But if he could have beaten Pataki in '02, in '08, he is probably a two-term Democratic governor of New York. So you look at how history might have been different, based on how you're postulating in here what might have lie ahead for him. I mean, we're in a situation where, is Hillary somebody who wins in '08 because she's able to split the pack with Obama, John Edwards, and JFK Jr.? Does Obama still win? Does JFK Jr. win and serve as a two-term president? It would have been tough running after George W. Bush because, again, typically we elect presidents that are different than the one that came before him, and I don't think electing the third son of a president as president right after the second one was necessarily going to work in his favor. But as you say, America had really kind of clutched this guy to his bosom, or to our bosom, ever since 1963, especially in the salute at the casket. So there are so many things that you postulate in there just by saying that he was looking to run. He was looking to get into the family business. And there, again, you sort of leave it at that point there of what might have happened. But you open up so many unanswered questions about how everything in American life might be different today had he lived, because who knows where he could have gone.
Well, I'm as convinced as ever that you're right. He would have, if he had run against Pataki in 2002, I think he would have won. He would have been I don't think he would have challenged Obama in 2008. He already proven he wasn't going to challenge Hillary in 2000 for the New York Senate seat. They wanted him to do that. He was thinking of doing that, and he decided that he wouldn't do that. He would let Hillary run, and of course she won. I think he would have absolutely have recognized the political significance, the historic significance of the Obama candidacy and presidency, and I think he would have respected that. So actually what I think is that we would have perhaps seen a John F. Kennedy Jr. versus Donald Trump 2016 election.
Wow.
And personally, I don't see how Donald Trump could have beaten John F. Kennedy Jr. I think there was just, we can stipulate, that Donald Trump has a lot of wattage too, but I think that John Kennedy Jr. had much more wattage than Donald Trump, was much more famous than Donald Trump, and would have swept the field, or certainly would have stitched together the Electoral College victory that he would have needed to win, and we would be living under a John F. Kennedy Jr. administration right now instead of a Donald Trump administration.
That is mind-blowing to think about that, but you're right. I mean, I can't argue with your logic on that. I will say this. Had he run in '08, had he decided to, this is one of the things that when you reflect back on that race, one of the big turning points in there. I think things were already starting to tilt momentum-wise Obama's way, but one of the big tipping points was when Ted Kennedy endorsed him over Hillary, and that came as a shock to a lot of people because it was somewhat going against the grain because she was as close to an establishment candidate as you could possibly have at that time. So at the very least, if he was running, you wouldn't have Ted throwing his support to Obama and tilting it in that way. But all these
I don't think he would have run.
Okay.
I don't think he would have. I don't think he would have. I think he would have seen the historic significance of either the first woman Democratic nominee or the first black Democratic nominee, and would have respected that. And he in 2016 he only would have been 56. So still young, not as young as his father, but still young, and still vibrant. And I think he would have respected that, and then run in 2016, swept the field, and would be president today.
Well, and again, I guess that's as good of a way to bring this sort of full circle as far as looking at how life turns out and how it goes counter a lot of times to what you expect, which is, I think, probably another theme of this book, because flashing back to 99, at the time that John F. Kennedy Jr. got on that airplane, again, somebody potentially with a bright political future in front of him, somebody who was, as you said, known worldwide. Barack Obama, a complete nobody at that time, and ultimately was pretty much politically for the next couple of years. 20 years later, Barack Obama's a two-term president, and we are sort of straining to remember John F. Kennedy Jr. Again, your book does a lot to kind of flesh out the real story behind him, but that's one of those things. You wouldn't have believed that in 99, looking ahead 20 years, it would have been, who's Barack Obama? And yet he's the guy who's a two-term president. John F. Kennedy Jr. doesn't live to see any of it. Again, that really, I think, is another sort of theme of the book, is you really just can't see ahead, as far as what's going to happen in your life, the emergences in other lives, because that's a microcosm right there. Nobody could have seen those two developments coming, John F. Kennedy Jr. dead and a guy named Barack Obama becoming president.
The fragility of life.
It is. It truly is, and this book does so much to sort of bring that about as far as the lessons behind it. 4 very compelling stories, and as you said, very human stories. These are very compelling stories to read. I felt you really did justice to your friends in terms of fleshing this out and giving the sort of three-dimensional picture of the lives that they lead and the demises that they met. 4 Friends, Promising Lives Cut Short by William Cohan. William, as always, thank you for being on the show. Another wonderful conversation with you, sir.
Really, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, William, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in to FDH Lounge mini episode number 1131.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, waitresses, strippers, bartenders, garbage men, janitors, microwave popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and the Periodic Table of Elements.